To switch. So dear audience, welcome in English. This is the third lecture in our NFDI InfraTalk session. And the idea of this session is that frequently we have speakers coming from various consortia of the NFDI. And it is a great pleasure today to welcome Professor Jörg Overmann, who happens to be I think are you a director actually? I couldn't find it on your website, from the DZEF, a director from the DZEF. And he is particularly knowledgeable in the area of bioresources, biodata, digital health. So these are the most prominent topics of his publications and his work. And today he will speak about a topic which is a quite important one, but actually which is maybe not on the agenda of all people from data infrastructure. However, this talk maybe will change your mind, and we will take the advantage of a round of discussion after the presentation, where you can ask your questions, where you can come up with a living discussion about where to go in the near future. Then let me say this: after reading about what is ongoing and what is actually the Nagoya Protocol and understanding what the consequences are, I can only agree that this is an urgent topic. And maybe we can contribute the one or the other thing. So please, Mr. Jörg Overmann, a warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll just have to upload the slides. I guess you can see this now. Yeah, thanks for the warm welcome. Maybe a little precision. I'm the scientific director of the Leibniz Institute DSMZ, and we are of course involved in the NFDI for biodiversity, as you will see in a few minutes. Before I touch upon the NFDI, what I would like to give you is first some reasoning or some developments which actually led to the strong political pressure which we suddenly, or since some years, experience and which increasingly move towards the management of research data, and also give a little bit of an overview on what the Nagoya Protocol actually is before we then get to the immediate consequences we are facing. So maybe a little bit of a background to make everybody understand what was actually the reason for the political pressure we currently experience. And there are several instances. I just give you a few examples here, and note that these are rather old examples. The one which is shown here is actually from Kenya, where a bacterial strain was isolated from high pH hot geysers, and an export permit was granted. Then a patenting of the enzymes from that organism happened, and this is an enzyme which was used for stonewash genes. So it was quite some substantial commercial income which was generated. You see the number here, 1 million. And then later on, quite later, another agency in Kenya claimed that it was responsible for the permit but never granted it, and that led to a multi-million-dollar claim against, and now note, a British university, such an academic institution, not just the US company who tried to take advantage of the enzymes. And you could give several examples like this, for instance, also with some grains, teff, called teff in Ethiopia, or you could just look in the patents, in the European patents, and you see it's 285 patents are based on plants used in traditional Indian medicine. Just an actual case which was finally resolved. I should probably say that many of these cases, which are sometimes dubbed biopiracy, have never been concluded really. There hasn't been a solution, a legal solution really. Another one comes from within a country, namely from South Africa. There an agency patented appetite suppressant from a plant called Hudia. Then finally, at the very end, the license for producing it as a medical component or as an additive to nutrition was finally sold for a substantial amount of money. And after long years of negotiation, the people who actually used that plant for generations and centuries, the Sankoi, they were granted a small percentage of the net profits. And just to show you that this is not only limited, and this is also, of course, important for us in NFDI, this is not only limited to commercial exploitation. This is but another example, in this case, a giant wasp, the so-called king of wasps from Indonesia, which was discovered simultaneously in the field by scientists from an Indonesian academic institution, LIPI, and UC Davis in the US, but also found in collections at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And then it was finally published 1 year later. However, scientists from LIPI were not involved because, again, the perception is different from different sides. But this led to substantial problems for subsequent collaboration work with Indonesia. So this is the situation. The term biopiracy is prominent in the discussion. And this was certainly one of the reasons why then the Nagoya Protocol was finally put in place. The Nagoya Protocol is in short for Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization, a very long title. And it's actually built upon the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And you're going to hear in this current discussion, besides Nagoya Protocol, also CBD, which is a Convention on Biological Diversity, ABS, that's access and benefit sharing, and DSI, I'll come to that a little bit later, digital sequence information. Now, what is it actually? Now, the key is the CBD, which was actually installed in 1993 in December, has three major goals. That is the starting point of everything. First, the conservation of biological diversity, and you all have followed the strong need, or you know about the strong need to put this into action, given the strong decline in biological diversity worldwide. Then the sustainable use of its component, and just as a remark, the idea was to enable especially developing countries to use this biological diversity to make them or give them the opportunity to conserve actually the biological diversity. So these points go together, and then of course to enable a sustainable use, also a fair and equitable sharing of the benefits based on the cases I've just shown you before. The goal here is to have mechanisms in place to enable developing countries in particular to gain benefits, and the benefits may be non-monetary, so education, knowledge transfer and such, but it may of course also be monetary, and that would of course be of interest for these countries as well. The concept rests upon the assumptions, and I'll come to that later, that the providers of genetic diversity or biological diversity are the developing countries, since they are the biodiversity hotspots. And that's certainly true for plants. The term biodiversity hotspots was actually created for regions which have a high diversity of higher plants and where many of them are threatened. And the users are seen as the industrialized countries. But however, I will discuss that a little bit later. Another important principle is scientific cooperation and knowledge transfer. And of course, one of the interests often of the industrialized countries is to protect the intellectual property. For instance, in the case of the Hudia plant of the sun in South Africa, the company claimed that it was never proven before that this was actually an appetite regulator, but they discovered it. So this is an important issue as well in this whole process. And Finally, we see from these examples which I gave you that separating non-commercial and commercial use is often difficult. What started as an interesting biodiversity study of the Kenyan lake ended up in some enzyme which could be used commercially. So this happened in 1993, in December, as I said, as the CBD entered into force. There are worldwide many countries who signed it. Importantly, there are two who didn't sign it, and one is the US, and the other is the Holy See, so the Vatican. And the fact that the US didn't sign it has also an important implication in the current discussion with the database. And what changed dramatically, or what changed substantially at that point, was that first, the sovereign rights over the genetic resources were now given to the countries. Before that, genetic resources were seen as a heritage of mankind, but now they are under the sovereign right of the particular country. Therefore, their access can only be granted by the national authorities, and there should be national strategies and research to monitor and conserve biodiversity according to the first and second goal of the CBD. And there are some compliance mechanisms. And the first one is called prior informed consent, and the second one, mutually agreed terms. And I'll come to that a little bit later. Now, in 2010, given the fact that the third goal of the CBD, namely the access and benefit sharing, was not very clear, there was an Nagoya Protocol, the so-called Nagoya Protocol in short, adopted to the CBD. Up to now, there are 130 ratifications. So a vast number of countries worldwide have ratified this Nagoya Protocol part of the CBD. I give you here the link. And the date which actually is most important for all of us is October 12, 2014, since at that time, the Nagoya Protocol entered into force as by the usual mechanism, and that is at UN level if 50 countries sign the appropriate this treaty. And there is now an EU regulation 511/2014 which applies, and you find the link here. For us in Europe, this is the legally binding regulation under which we have to work with all genetic resources. Now, let's do a Gedankenexperiment, and I would like you to think, whenever I now say genetic resources, like this is a term for biological resources or biological diversity, now think as if I would talk of data, and that will make clear what is looming for us. So what do we have to do according to the EU regulation 511? We have to do three things. First, everybody, and that means also in academia, who uses genetic resources, and that could be a bacterial strain, a plant, or an insect, or anything else, or part of it, has to legally acquire and document that this genetic resource is in compliance with the legislation, and that is in the EU 511, and that means we have to acquire the proper documents from the country of origin. We have to declare and prove that we exert due diligence. That means whatever we do to this genetic resource has to be traceable. We have to take measures to mitigate the risks and assess the risks. And the third one, there would be no sense in proving due diligence if that wouldn't be controlled. We have to enable inspections by the national authorities. Now, this all sounds a little bit theoretical. Now let's look into what that actually means. The mechanism to prove this and document this are called PIC, prior informed consent. I mentioned that before, and MAT. The prior informed consent you have to obtain before you do any type of research. You're planning a research project, this is what you have to get. Then if you plan in detail and start working, what you have to have is mutually agreed terms that actually tell both the partners how the use will take place and how benefit sharing measures are implemented. Often you get something which is different, which is called different. Many of the countries give you something which is called MTA, Material Transfer Agreement. That is not officially named in this in the Nagoya Protocol, but if you tell the authorities in that other country, like in a developing country, to also label this pig and mud, then it would be valid. There is also another mechanism if the country lists this pig and mud in an official database, then it is called IRCC. You see this here. So what does this actually mean? This mechanism is not just on paper. This mechanism is valid and legally binding for all of us since October 12, 2014. And the Federal Ministry of the BMU, the Federal Ministry of Environment and Nuclear Safety, it is in charge of the national policy for implementation, but the authority which actually not only coordinates the implementation, but which also is in charge of inspect everybody using genetic resources is the BFN, the Bundesamt für Naturschutz. And this is not just in theory, a violation of the Nagoya Protocol, and that is of the EU Regulation 511/2014, can be sanctioned by up to 50,000 euros. I should mention that in Spain, it will be 1 million if things go wrong. And this is not just theory, as I said. We have been informed by the BFN that lately there have been cases where the non-appropriate use of a genetic resource from another third world country was actually discovered. And there is currently a lawsuit filed against, or measures taken against that academic institution to see whether they are fined 50,000 euros. And this does not only relate to the academic institution as a whole, it relates to the researcher as well, privately. So this is serious. The situation we are in is serious. You could now, of course, say this is all related to genetic resources, but I ask you to think of data. But before I go to the data, let me show you the principal features now of the system we are under. First of all, it relates to any genetic resources except human. Human means human genetic material, but it doesn't mean necessarily human associated microbiome, just to make this clear. Second, it's bilateral. So it's always relying, and that is a problem, it's bilateral between the provider country and the individual user. So for any novel genetic resource, you have to get a new pig and mud and the new contracts. It differs between individual countries according to their policies and legislation. There is no really standardized procedures or forms. And we now have to actually document that, for instance, if applying for DFG funding, for the EU funds, and so on. Finally, these documents, which I mentioned, the PIC and MAT, they need to be stored for 20 years after the end of use. So you see that this is a very clear and strict legal situation, a legal framework. And now it is important, where does it apply to? The genetic resources are anything which is living, for instance, microbial strains. It could be plants, it could be parts of animals, whatever. What we all would already assume, everybody of you would assume that it will be DNA and RNA because it's called a genetic resource. But, and that is also interesting, biochemical compounds also count in, although they don't contain genetic information per se. So we see already in this definition that there had been some efforts to expand the extent or the field of application for this regulation. And this brings us now to the digital sequence information. So what this is, we would all probably assume, well, this is nucleotide sequence data, but however, this definition is not clear. There's no consensus internationally what is meant by digital sequence information, but this is now under discussion, how digital sequence information should or could be integrated in that legal framework of the CBD or maybe even the Nagoya Protocol. I would now apply the definition as has been put forward by the VBio, by the German history, Natural History Collections, and by the Leibniz Research Alliance Biodiversity, and just consider nucleotide sequence data for the moment. So far, this is not included in the Nagoya Protocol. So you might think that it is of no concern since it is out of this legal framework. But there are 2 points. The first point is that despite of digital sequence information not being part of the Nagoya Protocol, you will see if you work in other countries, as for instance DSMZ does, that over 30 countries have or will shortly implement bilateral ABS measures for the use of DSI. So you can only get documents which tell you what to do with the digital sequence information, although this is not according to the Nagoya Protocol, but it's under the authority of an individual country to have a different legislation, of course. And this is why we have de facto already a situation where in quite a few cases, you, for instance, are not allowed to just sequence a genome and then put that genome sequence in the database. Secondly, as I mentioned before, even more importantly, we have current intensive negotiation, not only current, it's already since 2 or 3 years, very intense negotiations to implement an ABS regime of one way or the other for the DSI. And what will probably happen in autumn is the Conference of the Party for the CBD, the 15th, that's COP15. And this might already be the place where negotiations, how to implement this on an international level will happen. And this is now, of course, both these points which I mentioned are of direct concern for us in the Nfdi. And that brings me now to the Nfdi for biodiversity. You may envision that we became very early on, very intensely involved in this matter, in particular our Leibniz Institute DSMZ. And I just give you a few points of the Nfdi for biodiversity, just for, as a matter of short introduction, but also to show those aspects which are of direct relevance to this legislation, and particularly to the new possible legislation for DSI. Our consortium has 15 co-applicants, and you see by the data center marks here that we have quite a few data centers here amongst us. And all these, of course, are essential for setting up this consortium and to make it function. Biodiversity, of course, comprises not only species or not only the DSI, the genes, but also functions or interactions and ecosystems. And that means that one of our major goals, of course, is to somehow assemble, link, analyze, or provide means of analyzing heterogeneous scattered data and improve the formats. We are now looking on over 800 data silos just in that area. And you see here some, they are broadly distributed all the way to ecosystem data, functional traits, separate for separate group of organisms. We have collections which have their own databases. You saw that amongst the 15 participants. You have even satellite data. And now the important thing is, this is not only different topics, it's also different agencies, different academic institutions and such, where these data are. They are very often not in a format which enables direct comparison and linking. And that means one of the really central tasks of the NFDI for biodiversity, of course, is to make these data linkable, or put it into a format and provide the means for actually integrating all this data for a meaningful knowledge generation. And this is an important part which I just want to show to argue or to demonstrate that it is not only the task of such an NFDI, and I'm sure that applies for all the other NFDIs as well, to just somehow store the data, but a very central part of it is, of course, the transformation of the data, the curation of the data, assembling the data from various sources, and then to actually conduct a semantic description, which enables then, only then enables the application of different tools and to actually provide the services and application for all the users. And that means NFDI is not just a simple broker for data. NFDIs do something to the data, and at the same time, and this is down here at the bottom, it is a key part of all the NFDI, obviously, and I don't have to tell you that, to establish a legal base and the appropriate licensing models to guarantee a free access to data across the disciplines. And these features then very clearly show that it will not happen that NFDI will be left out of this legal framework, whatever it will be, of managing DSI under the CBD. So now I get to the DSI. What are the current challenges? We have already contacted several NFDIs, and we know that at least beside us, 3 other, so 4 in total, NFDIs are certainly affected and will be affected. They are affected by the fact that there are already restrictions with over 30 parties of the CBD or 30 countries. But also there will be probably some others to come which will be affected. The existing restrictions for data publication are bilateral, as I showed you. Each country has its own non-standardized way of treating the paperwork, the PIC and the MAT. The biggest problem is that these informations are hardly accessible. NFDI, as I showed you before, using our example from NFDI for biodiversity, is not a simple broker. If we were a broker, we could maybe hope that the EU, like for the physical resources, says the collections who just take the samples and distribute the samples, they are just the brokers, they are not responsible. I can tell you that DSMZ has not resorted to this role as a simple broker, because we found that our users, the ones who take our bacterial strains, who order our bacterial strains, they have no access to this information. And so we have to take the responsibility to make it feasible for them to legally use our resources. So NFDI as well will not be a simple broker. And that means we will be legally accountable. And what is important, the data users, so whoever downloads data or uses data, must be informed, must know whether he or she has to obtain individual permissions, and it must be possible to use, to trace the data use. And if that is not possible, which is most likely for a big database, then we must simply completely reject the acceptance of data which are not free based on the negotiations or on the documents of the country of origin. So for this part, namely dealing with the already current restrictions from the over 30 countries, we need suitable data policies and technical solutions. And as you may now understand very well, this is not an easy undertaking. And we need to somehow address these common challenges. This is common to most of us. And maybe this is a cross-cutting topic we need to deal with. And that needs to be dealt with now because the situation is already there. Let me just quickly show you what actually the mechanisms is if you're talking genetic resources. So take a bacterial strain or a plant. If you had a project, you have to decide, is this an ABS case? So are you in a country like India, which requires you to take the measures? Then you have to identify the regulations. You have to get a PIC and an MAT. Then you can take the sample. You might have an MTA as well. And only then can you do the research. If not, you might have other permits, still need to identify the regulation and so on. So this already tells you that this decision tree is very complicated. And I just show you what we have done at DSMZ for just bacteria sent to us, which are deposited in our collections or are to be deposited in our collection. And this is how this decision tree translates into an automated system we installed. So the system checks, is this past October 2014, that is the date where the Nagoya Protocol came in place. Is the country where it originates party to the Nagoya Protocol? You need to have that, and you need to have an actual list. Then you have to determine, is it still a free access? For instance, if the sample came before 2014, if it's regulated, you have to check, is it a PIC and MAT, which is required? Then you have to check the document, and only at the very end, we have people who actually check this. All the rest is automated, and that can lead to a rejection. This is, again, not theoretical. Let me tell you, since we implemented this and since we had to implement this, we principally do not take samples from Brazil, China, India, and Costa Rica, amongst others. And that is simply because these countries do not issue the permits that we can then subsequently distribute that to other scientists. And hence, we can't use it. We can't use that resource. And that, of course, means that scientists from Brazil, China, India, Costa Rica, for instance, cannot complete their PhD thesis if they are to deposit a bacterial strain with the DSMZ. Now, I told you, or I asked you, think of data instead of genetic resources. You can envision what that would mean if you're dealing with data under a similar regime. This is simply not possible. It's very clear. In addition, there is a large demand for information. This just gives you the statistics. If you go into to this website, this gives you the statistic of a new Nagoya Protocol hub, which we erected. And this just gives you the number of questions we have received shortly after implementing it. And now in the first 3 months, already a large number of inquiries. What we see is that especially upon announcement of controls by the BFN, people contact this hub to get information what they have to do. So there is a tremendous need for information regarding the existing legislation already in German academia. Another very important point is, which we shouldn't forget, if we have NFDA databases with provenance, with date of obtaining the data and so on, this would of course also provide a means for the authorities to systematically detect and prosecute violation of the ABS legislation much more efficiently than before. So I think even, especially for this point, we have, regarding this point, we have a big responsibility. So what we need for the conclusion one, which I showed you, we really need to find a way to deal with these challenges, and probably we should do that across several or maybe all NFDIs. There are many who are of concern. The second conclusion is, even from my perspective, even more pressing and even more important, because at stake are the reproducibility of data and the good scientific practice. If there is no access, free access to data, we all know that, then the concepts for and some of the current concepts of the DSI actually do that. That would defeat the whole purpose of the FAIR principles, of the whole open access strategy which we have, of the open science, be it in Europe, be it on a recent UNESCO recommendation on open science, or for instance, the journal Nature and other journals which now require actually to deposit in a public repository freely accessible the data of any publication in environmental sciences. So this doesn't go along with a control of DSI, especially not a bilateral control by individual countries. Now, I want to show you also something else, and that is an important argument to my opinion. If we had a monetary ABS mechanism associated with the data use, so whoever uses a data point from, say, Brazil, has to pay a certain fee, maybe 2 cents or something. It turns out that such a model will particularly affect the low and middle income countries, as I will show you in the next slide. So eventually what we, without any debate, to my opinion, need is a multilateral ABS mechanism, which is independent of the direct data use. And that is something which we have to convey to political decision makers urgently. Let me show you one of the strong arguments. This is a map, and this is part of a CBD study conducted by several people involved from DSMZ, but also from other institutions. And this shows where does all the DSI come from. And you see, and I mentioned this very much at the beginning, the origin of diversity data is not focused on low and middle income countries. You see that more than 50% of the nucleotide sequence data comes from 4 countries, and that is China, United States, Canada, and Japan. Note, United States are not part of the CBD. Now, you could ask, who is using the DSI? Interesting point, 50% of the up to 50 million users of DSI come from countries that do not contribute to the infrastructure costs. We are talking here mostly of GenBank, EMBL, and the Japanese database. You can calculate that the maintenance of this nucleotide sequence database costs about 50 million euros per year. So that would relate to about 3 to 5 euros per user. So these are important arguments. So if you now divide the used sequences by the deposited sequences per country, you get a very interesting map. And this map has no high values with industrialized countries, which would be the original assumptions that the industrialized countries exploit not only the genetic resources, but also the digital sequence information from these countries. That is the concern of these countries, based on the cases of biopiracy, which I mentioned before, that by using DSI, you can circumvent the application to use genetic resources themselves, and therefore circumvent the Nagoya Protocol, and therefore circumvent the access and benefit sharing. The actual situation, as we see it here, is that, for instance, Colombia, one of the hotspots with respect to plant biodiversity, has a high fraction of use and a high ratio of sequencing used versus sequences deposited. And so you see that access and benefit sharing actually happens already unexpectedly in many of the countries which do not really contribute much to the databases. So providers are not the developing and users are not necessarily the industrialized countries. And that, I think, tells us we need to find a very different solution, and that can only be multilateral. So why do I think there is a call to action? In April, actually next Wednesday, there is a meeting of the EU expert group, which evaluates position of the EU regarding policy options. And there are different ways. One way of dealing with DSI would be under the Nagoya Protocol, and that means a bilateral model. And that would mean all the difficulties and all the challenges, which I mentioned before, will happen also for DSI. Then there is a discussion forum and webinar. Everybody can join, where this is actually discussed openly. You have two bodies which are providing advice to the working group, which then later prepares the documents for the convention, for the COP15 in China, in Kunming, China. And these meetings will happen beginning of May and will close beginning of June. And from here, from this Substar and SBI meetings, there will be advice funneled to the open-ended working group, which meets in August, exact date is not clear, and prepares the document for COP15, and then COP15 will take place, probably, depending on COVID, in October. Which means at this is a point where decisions likely will be taken. But this is a point within the next 1-2 months where decisions can be influenced and can be where advice and expertise from data science, which is so far not that extensive, I should say, can be actually funneled into this process. So, in short, it is very clear that NFDI needs to urgently engage in policy advice now. I think everybody will benefit, the whole system will benefit if expertise out of this circle here from the NFDI and centrally can actually brought into the process if policymakers are advised now before decisions are taken, which then in the end will not work for data exchange and data policy. Just as a last point, I think it is very important to do this now. I mentioned that countries and policymakers do not agree on DSI, what DSI actually means. There has been, of the ad hoc technical expert groups, these are groups which actually try to define certain processes and to come up with definitions of certain elements. They suggested that besides nucleotide sequence information, what could also fall under DSI could be ecological relationships, abiotic factors of the environment, so nutrient elements, whatever, behavioral data, and phenotype. Now, envision if images of phenotypes, digital images, information on phenotypes is under restriction. So that means you couldn't do this anymore. This would be very clearly illegal if you didn't have the permission to use a pattern of a butterfly in a design which you can use exploit commercially. We have to be clear that discussions go into this direction if it is not, if reasonable and functional and fair mechanisms of multilateral access and benefit sharing, independent of the individual data use, can be implemented. It is very urgent to find this mechanism to prevent an expansion of this whole discussion on DSI in that direction, which I mentioned here. So, and this is, I think, what we need to take. This is a route we have to take for a free and open access and sharing of data for the benefit of everybody on this globe. And thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much. And on behalf of the audience, I give you a little applause. Thanks for giving a very good presentation. And thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. And you brought up some questions, so I would be very happy to dive into a discussion now. And I would like to kindly introduce Eva Lübke, who is the Administrative Director from NFDI, who will moderate the upcoming session, so I can also participate in the scientific discussions with my expertise. Please, Eva, take over.
Yes, thank you a lot. So thanks again also from my side for this very knowledgeful presentation. I think everybody now has a good overview, not only like a broad overview, but also like a deep overview about what the Nagoya Protocol is about. To organize the discussion a little bit, I would ask all who want to ask a question to either type a Q into the chat or to type your question into the chat. And I'm very much looking forward to all your contributions and questions. So I can't see any question at the moment. Is there a technical problem with the chat, or are you completely convinced and want to start now? Okay, I see Barbara Ebert from Nfdi Biodiversity, who has the first question.
Oh, yeah, I hoped I wouldn't be the first, but so be it. Yes, thank you for that presentation. I've been part of the preparation, so this comes not completely unexpected in the impact this Nagoya Protocol has and the digital sequence information. My question is regarding if you could give your opinion if the new UNESCO Open Science recommendation that is being developed in parallel and that will also be signed by all these countries or expected to be negotiated with all these countries, do you expect it will be strong enough or have any impact on the willingness of these countries to share digital sequence information in a more open manner?
I mean, I've been in quite a few countries because we scientifically work there, and my experience is that I would be rather pessimistic that there will be a strong influence of this open access paper on this current discussion. It has been too long, and the political pressure is too strong, I think. Given all the decades of discussion, why don't we get a share of the tens of millions or even billions of rewards from developing antibiotics? That's always the argument. Yeah.
Okay.
So I can't see that this will make a big difference. What will make a difference is a positive, constructive suggestion or recommendation how to implement a better system than the bilateral system. I don't think we can entirely avoid some sort of negotiation here and some sort of resolution, which is understandable, I think, from the point of view of many developing countries. But we have to make sure that in the end it doesn't backfire. That's what I try to show. Yeah, and therefore we need the specialists really to better advise and urgently advise the policymakers now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see questions from Jörg Overmann and Frank Broder, and I would suggest that you just raise your questions. Maybe they also, and then Jörg Overmann, you can answer both questions at the same time.
Okay, so let me come straight to the point. I would have some detailed question, but maybe we can do that afterwards. You made the point it is really urgent. There's a small time window, like beginning of May, which is really upcoming. Frankly spoken, I think to me it seems like a rather complicated legislative aspect. So my question would be, whom do you expect to contribute to this urgent discussion? Because somehow you have to get up to speed and understand what actually is the problem just understanding the problem. And then the next point is to have an informed opinion of what to bring into the process. And both things, both of these issues to me seem non-trivial. So my question is, who really is able to participate in these upcoming discussions? Thank you.
Frank Bruder.
And yes, maybe you can correct me. As the digital sequence information is a new aspect to the Nagoya Protocol, but currently, at least the Nfdi for chemistry would be affected also on a small molecule scale. And there's one additional aspect also, the indigenous knowledge, which might be of relevance for the culture or social sciences. Because if you go to some indigenous people and they tell you how they deal with some physical conditions, then this would fall under the ABS and CBD mechanism. And the same is true if you isolate some compounds of a plant or a microorganism you get from other countries. And so even if you do not deal with genetic information, then we will have to implement some mechanism to deal with these nasty legal framework.
Yeah, maybe I first take the question of Frank Broder here because it's more detailed, and then I'll address the one of Jörg Overmann. Yeah, I was a little bit short. I was sort of not elucidating too much on indigenous knowledge, which is of course part of the ABS regime of the Nagoya Protocol. That's entirely correct. So far, elucidating chemical compounds from plants from outside Europe often is under restrictions according to the Nagoya Protocol. That is evident, including also indigenous knowledge. The question is to which extent the information on the chemical compounds is under restriction. That is not regulated by the Nagoya Protocol at present. Yeah, so I was pinpointing the open or the bilateral and not clear regulation regarding the information, and that relates exactly to the chemical information as well. So you might have an MTA or a PIC and MAT, which does not allow you to upload a structure in a database. This wouldn't be covered by the Nagoya Protocol, but it would be covered by the national legislation. Yeah, I know that some countries are restrictive in that matter, but you have to check this. Before you upload it, you would have to check exactly what country did it come from, and is there a restriction which does not allow you to do that. But for that, you need to see those papers. Yeah, so it's very complicated. What will happen at some point is to regulate bindingly across all the signatory states of the CBD how we deal with that information. That is not regulated yet, but restrictions, as I said, in more than 30 countries are already in place, but not generally organized, not easily accessed. Yeah, that is a problem. Now to the general question. Yes, it is very urgent, but many, especially in Germany, many different groups, including the VBio, including Leibniz, of course, and several others, have worked hard to provide information, to participate in the discussion. And part of that, the coordinators of the different Nfdis have already been sent via the DFG, as you all saw. And that is part of an initiative of the working group ABS within the Senate Commission on Biological Diversity of the DFG. And that was exactly a way to prepare everybody and also to get the Nfdi prepared for contributing now some knowledge. it is not from scratch. Nobody has to work from scratch because I briefly mentioned this. There are policy options which have been developed, and these are now the official policy options which are under discussion, like the one workshop which I mentioned. And the EU will discuss these existing policy options. And what is needed now is to provide policymakers in Germany with the information which of these policies which are on the table will work and which of them will be catastrophic. So the first 2 or 3 options are bilateral. And if we do not convey the information very clearly that a bilateral system in a database structure like Nfdi will never work, yeah, it could happen that the EU then in the end during negotiations agrees to some sort of bilateral system. We know that several countries favor a bilateral mechanism because it's all about control. If you're bilateral, you control exactly what happens with your data. It's hard for these countries to accept that we are part of a large network where bilateralism in data science never works. Yeah, it's very hard for them to give up control on their not only genetic resources but by diversity data. So a clear, short, and well-founded intervention or advice at the uppermost political level within the next 2 months, to say this very clearly, is what is needed. We don't need another white paper. They have several, the one from the DFG is the last in a series of papers where the Allianz, Leibniz, and all these institutions have provided information and have also very clearly phrased their concerns. We need now direct political advice on the political level, which participates in the decision-making process on the EU level. Not more and not less. That's what I think. No further paper or things like that.
Okay, thank you for your explanations. I have now 3 questions or contributions from Frank Oliver Glöckner, Jörg Vetter, and Bernhard Miller. My suggestion is that we collect all these questions and contributions, and again, you have another round of answers. The talk is considered to be a 1-hour event, so I think then we can also do a wrap up and continue the discussion in the WonderMe tool where we can all switch to. The link will be presented to you in the end of the talk.
Okay, then I continue. So many thanks, Jörg, for this really enlightening talk. So sure, I'm also involved in the preparation and in the Nagoya, somehow following me since some years. The question is, or maybe just to recap it, is point is we cannot ignore it anymore. So I think this was a very clear message. Also, we all most probably agree that we should simply ignoring DSI. We hope that it will never come. But the problem, what I also learned from other sides, is at the moment we cannot do this anymore, and it will come. And if you don't influence it in the right way, it will come in a way that we don't want it. And so the multilateral idea that you mentioned, so still I'm struggling a bit. How can we imagine this? Because do we have a GEMA now, which means we all pay for using the music everywhere, or is it this is. So what can we offer at the end? So because nothing, if we don't offer anything, that will not work. So we have to offer something. No. Jorg, I think you are the next with your question.
Yeah, sorry. I was still thinking about your question. So here's my question. And it's an unfair one, but I mean, what would be the elevator pitch for a political person to persuade this person to do a favorable thing right now? What is the 40-second message? So it can be a very short answer.
Bernhard Müller?
Well, thank you very much. I don't think my question is much better than the last two ones, but you sketched a dilemma, right? I mean, some countries in a multilateral setting are interested in commercial or their own, let's say, property rights. And sort of what you sketched out, on the other hand, is an interest in fair data, sort of scientific knowledge generation, which is by and large a first world problem. So how, and this sort of gets to Jorg's point, how could anyone make an argument of how to leverage sort of the scientific advantages against the much more deeply ingrained, probably, interests of the negotiation partners? Yeah.
Okay, first, the multilateral mechanism. This is, of course, still under discussion, but there's an echo somehow. There are very few very important hallmarks. The one is no direct licensing. So it cannot be that downloading data is based on a cost model. Yeah, so there's no commercial license, or I should phrase it in another way. The use should not be directly paid for. And the reason is that if you pay for the use, who is going to pay the most are the ones who have the least money. And that relates to the two other questions as well. It is not a first world problem that we share data. On the opposite, if you go to Peru, the people will tell you, how can you help us to establish a GBIF node in Peru? It doesn't work for us. We desperately need it. Can you help us? How can we get the knowledge? How can we establish that? How can we connect to the database so that we have access to the data? There is no clear-cut two parts of the world. The one is the scientists and the ones who want to have free access, and the other ones want to sell their data. This is not working. This is not how it works. Yeah. So no direct cost model. And the second one is it must be truly multilateral. There cannot be any, and this is a key, direct control of a country over its over the way the data in the databases are used, because then once you implement that, it's not going to work. What the cost model exactly is under discussion. There are several ways to think about that. Micro-levy, for instance. What is also clear, maybe that is the third point in response to Frank Oliver. Whatever the costs for use of sequences would be, it would never be enough to pay for anything substantial of biodiversity conservation. We've done some calculations. It is documented how many million euros it will take to save the Brazilian rainforest. You will never get these millions out of a licensing model. That's very clear. What you need is, you need a central fund where some sort of money, which depends on the amount of sequences a country deposits in a common database, goes in, but also other funding mechanisms go in. Otherwise, you will never get sufficient money to do what people always link to this DSI question, namely the protection of biodiversity. It's always linked in this discussion currently. And if you want to have enough money, you need a different model. The costs from individual sequence use will never suffice to do that. So now this elevator pitch question. I would say, if you really want to achieve for the third world country or the low and middle income countries, a sustainable model of access and benefit sharing, you must do a multilateral system, and you cannot raise money from individual sequence use. It is simply not possible. It will end up the way we're, in a way, even more worse than we are now. Namely, that many countries say we have gone through the Nagoya CBDs and the Nagoya Protocol, and up to now it has never lived up to the expectation. We have never gained sufficient money. We all know that biodiversity is not equal money. Somehow people have promised them, these countries, to do that this happens. It will be even worse. Whatever you do with the DSI licensing model, it will never, ever raise enough money in a substantial amount that you can pay the protection of the Brazilian rainforest alone, even alone. Yeah. So that is the key, I think. I hope I answered at least part of the question.
So, thank you very much for the last round of questions and answers here in this presentation in the InfraTalk. So I think I switch back to Jorg